Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I'm Stephanie Murphy, and welcome to Libertopia. You've already been here for a couple of days, but welcome anyway. Today I'm going to be talking about podcasting. And this is a favorite subject of mine because I am actually a triple podcast host, as I indicated here on the slides. I'm involved with 3 different podcasts. Let's Talk Bitcoin. It's a show, twice-weekly podcast about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. Free Talk Live is a nationally syndicated radio show that's heard on terrestrial radio and XM, as well as being a popular podcast. And Pork Therapy, which is my own little side project. It's a podcast, and it's about personal freedom. So all kinds of stuff to talk about today. Here's my talk. If you want a successful podcast, this is what you do. No, I'm just kidding. This is not how you do a podcast, but a lot of people think, oh, it might be a good idea to do a podcast. You know, that sounds like fun. It's probably pretty easy. All you got to do is just get a microphone, talk into the microphone, and if you have something to say, it'll be a successful podcast. But there's actually a lot more that goes into it, and I think we can go about thinking about podcasting consciously, maybe even if we don't want to be podcasters ourselves, but just to kind of think about other people who are doing podcasting and why they might want to do it. So my goals today for what I want to talk about are, if you are thinking about becoming a podcaster, you in the audience or you listening in podcast land, because this talk is going to be a podcast, how meta, right? Or listening on YouTube. If you're thinking about becoming a podcaster yourself, we can explore that possibility and how we might want to go about that and maximize your time in doing that. Maybe you already are a podcaster, but you want to do a little bit of thinking about your podcast and how you could make it better, how you could improve it, how you could solve some issues that you're facing right now. We'll do that too. Or maybe you just want to understand or know a little bit more about what other podcasters do. Maybe you're like a fan of podcasts and you want to get more of an understanding. So all of those things I think we can do today in this workshop. So, okay, first of all, what is a podcast? Does anybody have a definition of a podcast that you want to throw out there?
Radio on the internet.
Radio on the internet. Oh, I like that one. Anybody else?
RSS feed that's linked to an MP3 file.
Oh, there's a lot of 3 letters in there. Yeah, so those are some podcast jargon. An RSS feed is really simple syndication. It's a way of people that people can subscribe to content and have it delivered to them. And an MP3 is a format for sound. So yeah, what I thought of as a podcast, and this is just my little definition, is it's audio or maybe sometimes video that's conveniently delivered to a listener or made available for them to download. And it's a pretty simple thing, but podcast has become a really popular medium over the past, I would say, 7 years or so. And there have been people that have kind of been doing podcasting since like 2003, so it's probably been around, you could say, maybe for 10 years or more. But it's really caught on. Most people have favorite podcasts that they listen to. Most people have a podcast client on their phone, or a podcatcher, as it's sometimes called. And a lot of people have shows that they tune into on a regular basis for information, entertainment, or all other kinds of purposes, learning about different things. But the key is that it's really convenient to get a podcast as a listener. It's just, you can put it out there, and you don't have to be a journalist. You don't have to have any credentials. It helps if you have maybe some credibility, right? But you don't need like a degree in podcasting or anything. Anybody can do this, which is why it's so great, because it brings people's expertise to the internet, and then it makes it available to anybody who's interested. So why would somebody want to be a podcaster? There are all different kinds of reasons that I've written down here, but I want to hear what you think. Why would somebody want to be a podcaster? Why would you ever want to do this? Talk into a microphone. To make a living, yes. Some people podcast for profit, right? For marketing, yeah, to sell a service or a product or an ebook. Education, yeah, to teach something. What's that?
The frustration with the lack of good information being out there, that you see other people getting mostly things not quite right, or just, well, I've got something that I think, yeah, I can do it, or so basically, or just to be fair, just wanting to contribute.
So basically because somebody is wrong on the internet. That's why somebody would want a podcast. Right, but to contribute, yeah, sure, I think that's a need that people have when they're podcasting. Anybody else? Reasons why you would want a podcast? Matt?
To improve your society.
To improve society, that's a very lofty goal, yes. And in the back.
Well, from a personal point of view, to like create a tangible form of participation in a community, or in a community that you care about. Like if you care about certain issues, it's a way to get your voice out there, and if it catches on, great. If it doesn't, no loss.
Yeah, to be part of a community, to meet people, to connect with other people, definitely. And
to have fun.
To have fun, yes. Okay, so you've done the work for me. You have gotten all of the reasons that I thought of that somebody might want to do a podcast out there already, to connect with other people, being part of a community, being heard. Actually, I guess maybe we sort of got that one, but some people just like to be heard and listened to, right? And what better way than to put out what you have to say on the internet and have people listen to you? Of course, sometimes it's hard to know if people are actually listening to your podcast, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And to be recognized maybe as an expert or somebody who has knowledge about a particular subject, to share your knowledge, to give to others, to improve society, or to create social change. And some people do it for income or profit and fun. So I guess the point that I wanted to make with this is, if you're going to be a podcaster, podcasting, like any project, can have its ups and downs. And so something has to keep you going. So it really helps to identify what you get out of podcasting, or what you hope to get out of podcasting, before you even do it. So you can have those goals when you're like, oh, it's been a week since I released an episode. I don't really have anything to talk about this week. What am I going to do? My feed's broken. My website's down. I don't have any subscribers. I don't know if anyone's listening. Something's got to keep you going. So it really helps to think about what needs you might be meeting for yourself as a podcaster up front. So what are your goals for podcasting? That's sort of another question that's secondary to like what needs are you hoping to meet by being a podcaster? Any answer is fine. But it's important to ask what your goals are so that you can most effectively plan out what you want to do with your media that you're creating. So what might some goals be like for a podcast? Why, what might somebody be hoping to accomplish with their podcast? Anybody?
Get 100 listeners.
Get 100 listeners, yeah. They want people to hear them, yeah. Anything else?
Well, you give yourself a voice, but also you give a voice to people that you know that you talk about. Like it's all these topics, whether it's voluntarism or Bitcoin or anything else, there's basically a conversation going on. So I mean, my goal is like, I want to be part of the conversation. I don't want to just be on the sidelines listening. And then I know people that also want to be part of the conversation, but maybe they don't have the means.
Right.
That's a goal too. It's just like get your voice out there into the discussion.
So participate in a conversation, connect with the community. Yep.
To do a high quality presentation that is valuable to people who are listening.
Yeah, to give something of value and to make a high quality impression on the world, to put out something that you're proud of. Yeah, so all of those things. I mean, people do podcasts for all different kinds of reasons, but some people want to be listened to, right? Some people want to share things with the world. Some people want to be experts. Some people want to market their products or books or whatever. Some people want to be funny, want to brighten people's day. Some people want to share liberty ideas, create social change, like Matt said. So, there are all different kinds of goals, but it really helps to know what your goals are in a very clear way if you're going to be a podcaster. And you can kind of look at podcasts that are out there and say, what do I think these people are doing with their show? What do I think their goal is? And are they effectively, doing that with their podcast? That's a great way to kind of look at your own goals and compare it to other podcasters that are out there. Because being a podcaster is relatively easy, like the barrier to entry is low, there are lots and lots and lots of podcasts out there. And as you all know, some of them are better quality than others, right? Some of them you want to listen to more than others. So what I suggest if you're thinking about podcasting, or if you already are a podcaster, is become a podcast connoisseur. Like listen to all the podcasts that you can and find the ones that you like the best. and then try to emulate what they do or pick out little elements of what you like about those and do that. What do you like about your favorite podcasts? What makes your favorite podcast different from all the other podcasts that are out there? That's a really important question because people have just unlimited access to all this free content. So why would they listen to your show when they could have all the free content they want? They're at like a smorgasbord, like a buffet of free content on the internet. So why would they listen to yours? And what keeps you listening? What keeps you hooked once you find a podcast that you really like? So does anybody have any favorite podcasts and want to share like why they keep listening? Yeah.
All right, Gnostic Media is a big one. Corbett Report. Sometimes I listen to. I'm trying to think of the name of it.
Pork therapy.
Pork therapy. Let's talk Bitcoin.
Bitcoin's up, yeah. Well, I call it. It's funny. I call it Bitcoin Talk, but yeah, it's Let's Talk Bitcoin. That's a recent one as of a couple months ago.
So what keeps you listening to Gnostic Media? Why do you listen to that instead of other content?
Well, this is it. Like everybody else, I have my media habits, right? And so when I'm driving in the car or I'm working or whatever, like podcasts are a very convenient medium because I can do other things while I'm doing it. And,
so there's convenience in the podcast format, but what's
the folks that they interview? It just brings new stuff to the table in my mind, like that
novelty,
is totally fresh compared to what my normal surroundings have to offer me.
Right.
And you know what? It's turned into like I have my own circle of people that I talk to on the phone. And like when it comes to your whole presentation, the point is like what would be great is to get the conversation going that I have with my friends in a podcast format so other people can hear that conversation. Because a lot of times that's essentially what these podcasts are. They're conversations between friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have favorite?
Yeah, I also like Adam Carolla's podcast. There's a lot of humor in that, and Kevin Smith does his James Silent Clock. So a lot of the humor, a lot of people inject a good amount of humor, keep them coming back, and keep the conversation lively. And I also like a lot of educational podcasts because not only do you learn something by listening to them, but also you can get yourself involved in a lot of the educational community surrounding those podcasts. And there's a lot of self-help education out there that keep me coming back.
Yeah. So I'm hearing learning, humor keeps you coming back, convenience, being part of a conversation, getting to, I guess, participate in a cool conversation among a group of friends. So yeah, all of those things. Yep.
No State Project.
No State Project, yeah. What keeps you listening to that?
This one out there, Peace Revolution with Richard Grove. That one is like blown my mind a lot of times. Like they're super long, but
yeah, new ideas. Yeah, it's getting new things. So
also Red Eyes Radio.
Right. So what keeps you listening to those?
Well, it's the No State Project is this very simple set of concepts that you just go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you internalize it.
Yep, exploring ideas.
Learn in depth and make it part of your life. And then Red Eyes Radio, Henrik just presents some of the most fascinating people from around the world.
Interesting people, yeah.
He does great interviews.
Interviews, yeah. So, okay, so those are all some elements that might keep somebody coming back to a podcast. So I want to talk a little bit about the format of a podcast because that's huge. It determines it sets the pace for the whole show. It determines what the show is actually going to be like. So let's break it down into these 6 elements and figure out, maybe what you might want to do with your podcast in terms of these things. And you can really lay out like a very detailed plan for a podcast if you want to, if you kind of think about some of these things in advance and figure out what you like about existing podcasts and what you might want to do. So hosts, that's huge. The hosts are going to really contribute a lot of what a podcast is about. So who are they and why are they podcasting about this subject, right? It comes down to defining your goals. So if you have a host that has really clear goals for their show and they are there for a reason and they're talking about that, people appreciate that, right? And they can tell why this person is doing a podcast and why they're passionate about it. Are they articulate? Can they express ideas in a concise way. I mean, conciseness is not required for a podcast, but it probably can help keep people listening to it. Do they have a pleasant voice? That's kind of important, right? It's audio format. If it's a video podcast, are they interesting to look at? That helps. Are they confident behind a microphone? Are they funny? You know, humor is a huge thing that people love in a podcast. So can they be funny? Are they technically competent? Can they run a podcast? Like, do they know how to record? Do they know what equipment to use? Do they know how to make audio sound pleasant or good to listen to? Can they tell the difference between high and low audio quality? When I first started podcasting, I did not have like the sea legs for my ears, basically. I couldn't really tell like what distinguished poor audio quality from high audio quality. So the first content that I put out was just, you know, recorded on an internal microphone in a laptop, and that wasn't very high quality. You could hear the fan in the background, and it was kind of faint, and the volume leveling was off. But over time, you know, I really picked up on how to make that sound a little bit more listenable. And oftentimes people, you know, if they're evaluating a new podcast, will check the audio quality first. And they don't always know exactly what makes great audio quality, but they know it when they hear it. So if they hear a podcast that there's a huge hiss or a hum in the background, or it's just really unpleasant to listen to, usually they'll tune out within a couple minutes, and they may never come back. So audio quality always really helps. And do they like podcasting, right? You want a podcast host who loves what they're doing, and that comes through on the show. Another question is, how many hosts do you want to have? So there are lots of different podcasts out there. Some of them are monologues, so you could have like a solo show. Some of them are two hosts. Sometimes they have chemistry. Sometimes, like thinking like Keith and the Girl, you know, was a very popular podcast, and they were, you know, a couple that was doing a podcast. You could have three hosts, like Free Talk Live has three hosts. That seems to work pretty well. Sometimes they rotate, you know, so sometimes there are like consistent voices, and then they'll like, you know, two consistent hosts, and they'll bring in a different third every week or every episode. Sometimes there's just kind of a pool of hosts that is sometimes on. It kind of works best, I think, when there's at least maybe one or two consistent voices on there. This Week in Tech is kind of like an example of a popular podcast that does the rotating cast thing, and they do it pretty well. But there's always Leo Laporte, so you know there's some consistency there. And you could have more than three hosts on a podcast. Although it gets a little bit tricky, because what happens is you have to make sure everybody has a microphone and that their audio quality is coming in. So the more voices you have, the more complicated recording is going to be. Another issue comes in if there's a geographical separation between the hosts. So we'll talk a little bit more about doing a podcast when they're separated later, but if you're not in the same room together, it can affect the chemistry and the flow of the show, as well as recording and technical difficulties. Did you have a question?
Yeah, if you just have one microphone, could you just like I talk into it and then you talk into it, kind of that thing, or do you have to have individual microphones?
Yeah, so the question was, if there's only one microphone, could you have a bunch of people sitting in a room and everybody talks into the same microphone? Yeah, absolutely, and a lot of people do that. The issue with that is that sometimes the volume of different people's voices is naturally different. So either you'd want to have some volume leveling to equalize people's voices, or you would want to kind of adjust your distance from the microphone. So you got to do a little testing with it. But audio quality is all about just testing different things.
There's another option that also comes out with that if everyone has a set of headphones, so you can all hear what the incoming quality is,
Right.
people will on the fly adapt by either raising their volume or getting closer to it, because they'll get a sense of how their audio is in comparison to everyone else and how they're talking.
Yeah, so being able to monitor your voice live as you're doing some kind of recording is great. And there's a couple of ways you can accomplish this. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but if you just have one microphone and you have multiple hosts, you can plug that microphone into a computer and record directly from that. And then maybe you could have a cable coming out of the microphone that has a splitter that goes to different headsets. So that way everybody could hear what's being recorded into that microphone and monitor their voice in real time. The issue with that is that some people like the volume higher and lower. So, you know, there's always kind of creative ways to work around that. So And if you have a mixing board, you can kind of do the same thing where the audio out goes to a little box and it has 4 different controllers, and each one has a headset, and everybody can kind of tune up and down the volume on their headphones individually. So there's lots of technological solutions, but you can kind of figure that stuff out, and that information is out there on the internet. I just kind of wanted to provide some food for thought about like the format of a show. So whatever you want to do, you can do it. It's just a matter of sort of finding those solutions and figuring out what you want first. The frequency of a podcast is, that's an interesting question. How often do you want your show to come out? If you're doing it for free, you may not have a lot of free time. If you have a day job in addition to your podcast, maybe a weekly is all you can handle, or less than a weekly. Some podcasts come out every 2 weeks, but weekly is the most common frequency of podcasts for a reason, because people learn that every Wednesday, Sex Nerd Sandra comes out, or every Tuesday, Savage Love is going to have a new episode. And so they come back and they check on your website or your feed on that day, and then they look forward to it. It's almost Wednesday. I can hear my favorite podcast now. And it kind of leaves them wanting more. And so, and some people, they have a lot of different podcasts that they listen to. They may not have time to listen to more than one show of your particular podcast per week. So you want to make sure that you're releasing content that people have a chance to listen to, but also that they know it's coming. So there are all kinds of different formats for podcasts, but I would just suggest consistency really helps, because then people can predict, sort of when an episode is coming out, and they'll learn to check back on it. Daily is a cool format because people can get addicted to podcasts, like they'll really, really like a show, they'll really get passionate about it, and they'll say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could hear Let's Talk Bitcoin every single day? But that is really difficult, especially if you have multiple hosts. It's hard to keep to a schedule where you can release content every day, and especially if you're trying to keep current with what's going on in the world. I wrote down like how newsy is your show. So is your content kind of timeless? If so, maybe you could pre-record a bunch of content and then just release it every day of the week, even though you recorded it all on Sunday. But if your content is more kind of news and current events, you may have to actually do a show every day. So that gets into when you start to quit your day job and stuff like that. So I put up whenever, man, because some podcasters just, whenever I feel like it, that's fine. You could do a podcast whenever you feel like it. It's just sometimes, people may not know that your new episode is out, right? So they don't know that it's coming. And so unless you are really great at announcing it and promoting it through social media, they're not going to know that there's a new episode. So there are trade-offs to all these things. How long is your podcast going to be? There's such a diversity out there. I mean, this is a great thing about podcasting, is that anybody can be a podcaster, and so there's a market of different formats and different qualities that podcasts have. There's a real range that's serving different people's interests and wants and needs of what they desire in a podcast. So you have everything from podcasts that are literally under 2 minutes. There's a great podcast called 90 Seconds on Sex. It's 90 seconds on sex, and it's very entertaining. It's highly produced, it's great quality. It's got an expert, Paul Joe-Nides. Voiceover Minute is another one that I listen to. It's under 2 minutes, but it has a tip about voiceovers. So, and these are very specific kind of niche podcasts, So if you were really wanting to do a short podcast, you could kind of write up a script for a bunch of them, record them all at once, and then kind of release one each week, and then you'd have a podcast feed full of content that's about your specific subject, and it has a 2-minute tip on each little thing. And then you get into podcasts that are about 10 minutes. It's like, oh, okay, sometimes people don't want to click play if they feel like it's a big investment. So if they see a 2-hour show come across their feed and they're not sure if they really want to start listening to a 2-hour show right now, then they may be hesitant to even click play in the first place. So sometimes having a shorter length will entice people. They'll say, oh, it's only 10 minutes, and if I don't like it, I can shut it off anyway, right? So there are lots of popular podcasts that are in the kind of 10 to 30 minute range. And then you get into like the little more meaty podcasts, which are a little bit longer. And some of those are, I think Liberty people in particular have a real desire, a lot of them have a real desire to explore ideas in depth. And that's another reason why people might want a podcast, because you don't have the limitation necessarily, unless you impose it on yourself, of having a fixed amount of time. You can make your podcast as long or as short as you want, so you can really explore those ideas in depth. And so there are a lot of Liberty podcasters who really take advantage of that, and they'll do a 2 or 3 hour show. I mean, more than 2 hours is kind of pushing it, but you know, it can get as long or as short as you want. And you know, it depends on what your goals are for the show and what you're trying to do with it. So that's the length is something to think about too. Okay, and as far as the layout of the show, there's a lot of different ways that people organize their shows or don't organize their shows. Some people literally, you know, like Free Domain Radio started out as a car cast, right, where Stefan's just talking into his mic in the car on his commute, and there was no theme song, there's no commercial breaks, there's nothing. It's just hey, this is Free Domain Radio, and you know, he starts to talk, and I'm not going to impersonate his voice here out of respect, but. So yeah, so you could have something that's, of course there's a structure to it because the podcast is about a certain idea or a certain concept, but there's not really a structure to how the show is laid out. Then you have shows that have a theme song, or they have an introduction that they play every single time so that you know it's coming. Did you ever think you'd find a show like this, right? That's the theme song to my podcast. So everybody knows when they hear that song, Pork Therapy is coming on, right? Or Free Talk Live, when they hear a certain music bed, it's going to come on. And it kind of gets the listener excited and gets them psyched up to hear what you have to say. Especially an entertaining or interesting theme song or introduction to your show can really hook a listener, you know, because if you can get them excited about what's coming with your introduction in the first couple of minutes, they're more likely to stay and listen to the rest of your show. So intros, bumpers, all that stuff can help. It helps to maybe rotate them sometimes because, you know, people can get to know all the lyrics of a theme song and then it gets a little bit old. But then there's also branding, you know, because maybe they associate that song with your show and that's forever embedded in their minds. And, you know, does the host kind of really act as a host, or are they more kind of having like a friendly dialogue and sort of, oh, hi, welcome to my podcast, or do they have something that they read every single time? Hi, this is Adam B. Levine, you know, and I'm here for Let's Talk Bitcoin. So how formal is it? You know, are they sort of talking to a friend? Are they talking to the world? Are they really trying to create serious change? What's going on there? Do they have commercials in the podcast? And are there hard breaks or are there soft breaks? A soft break would be like, well, about every 30 minutes, we're going to take a break when it's a convenient time in the conversation and play an ad or play a house ad. A house ad is something that promotes something about your own podcast or your website or something like that. Or are you going to play an external ad for some advertiser that's sponsoring your show? And when does that happen? You know, does it happen at convenient breakpoints, or does it happen every 10 minutes on the dot, 9 minutes and 40 seconds or whatever? And both have their advantages, right? Hard breaks are if you want to get used to doing content for radio, you're going to have to deal with hard breaks. And so it's best to develop your skills to be able to talk around those and make content fit into a segment of whatever length. But if you don't need to worry about that, if you're never going to be on the radio or you never want to, or you just want the freedom of a podcast to talk as long as you want about a certain topic, because you can totally do that, then, you know, maybe no breaks or a soft break would be best. And then does it have segments? You know, like Sovereign Tech has different segments that each are about a specific thing. Every week there's hacker stories, there's game of the week or whatever. And is your content arranged in a certain way? Like, do you do the news first and then talk about listener emails and then talk about Sex and Science Hour, for instance, or something like that, like my show? Is there any order to that? So that all that stuff can be planned out. What's your niche? That's an important thing for podcasting. niche podcasts can become incredibly popular, especially if there's not content out there right now that's fitting into that niche. Like, for instance, I think one of the reasons Let's Talk Bitcoin has become so popular in such a short time, we've been doing it since April of this year, 2013, and it's now August, and we get thousands of downloads. And so why is that so popular? Well, maybe because there aren't very many other Bitcoin podcasts, and maybe because people really want to hear a podcast about Bitcoin. I would guess that probably contributes to the success. Something to think about here is there are a lot of Liberty podcasts. There are tons of Liberty podcasts, and there are lots of Liberty podcasts that cover even different angles within that. And so now you're getting into a really, really specific niche for your podcast. So, I mean, what you want to cover or where you want to go with it is up to you, of course, but are you doing something new and different enough that people will want to listen to your show instead of other shows when they have limited time? And how much are you going to sort of stay within whatever niche that maybe it's described by like the name of your show or something like that? How much are you going to stay within that, and how much are you going to deviate, right? What content fits into your show and what doesn't? So yeah, you can podcast about anything, but do you want to? What do you want to talk about? There are some people who choose to basically make certain topics kind of off limits on their podcasts, right? Well, I'm going to talk about paleo diet, but I'm not going to talk about how the government lies to us about food because I don't want to scare people off who might not share that viewpoint. I think that's kind of Rob Wolf's approach, Or I'm going to talk about this specific thing, but I'm not going to talk about something else. So, what do you want for your show, and are you willing to put people off maybe with certain ideas, because not every listener is going to agree with you about everything, but you also want to share ideas. Probably that's why you're in the business of podcasting. So, what do you want to say? What exactly do you want to share? And how sort of scary are you willing to go? How much are you willing to push new ideas that people may not have heard before? How are you going to do your show prep? How are you going to decide what goes on your show? Do you have criteria for what's going to go on your show? And how are you going to organize it? You could have a Google Doc. A lot of shows have just Google Docs that they share with their hosts and their guests. Thinking about Puke and the Gang when I've appeared on that podcast, it's a comedy show. And they share a Google Doc with their guests and all the hosts before each show starts. There's also things like Trello, where you can kind of create these lists that have cards on them, and maybe each card is a show topic, and then you can have a list that says potential topics, upcoming topics, this show, or whatever, and you can move each card onto the list that corresponds to when you're going to cover it. So there's lots of cool ways to do that. There's other project management software too, like Strikebase, and there are like little forums that people use to collaborate on projects. There's Reddit. Sometimes people allow their listeners to suggest show prep on Reddit, and then they don't have to do anything. They just look at Reddit, and there's a Reddit for Free Talk Live or Let's Talk Bitcoin, and it's all there. And yeah, you did our show prep for us. Thanks. Some people play listener voicemails or let their listeners call in, so that's like they're doing the show prep for you as well. With a call-in show, as long as you know that there are going to be people calling in, you really don't have to do much preparation for it. It's just have a conversation with this person when they call in. And there's all kinds of ways to curate the content of your show, but it's really worth thinking about whether you want the content to mostly come from you, the host, or whoever the host is, or whether you want the content to be mostly driven by the listeners. And I think having at least some element of listener-driven content, people really appreciate, because they feel like they can send you an email and, oh my gosh, she read my email on the show. Like, that's really cool. I got to participate. And a lot of times when it's about being part of a conversation, that can be a great way to start that conversation with the audience. When you're recording, the idyllic recording environment is going to be quiet. It's going to be insulated from noise, background noise. You're not going to be using an internal laptop fan or a laptop microphone that has the fan picking up on it, ideally. And it's going to be ergonomic, because sometimes you can have a long podcast or long recording session where you'll be sitting there for a long time. So make sure it's comfortable. It's worth investing in some equipment like, a nice chair or a table that suits you very well. We'll talk about microphones in a minute, but they're going to be important too. State of mind when you're podcasting. If you're stressed or you're distracted or thinking about something else, it's really hard to do a podcast. And there's a temptation that a lot of podcasters have, including myself, where we'll record something, get a couple minutes in and say, oh, that sounded terrible. I'm just going to scrap it and start over. Because I can. It's a podcast. It's not live, right? Well, by the third time you do that, sometimes it can get a little tiring. So it really helps to have a little bit of a plan about what you're going to say and to be kind of in that mode of being ready to do a podcast before you sit down to do it. One of the issues with having multiple hosts can be that they can be difficult to coordinate, right? People are busy, they have busy schedules, so it can be hard to get 3 people to all meet up at a certain time. And especially hard if they have to all be in the same place. So that's great if you have people in your town who are talented and you want to do a podcast with, but what if they're across the country? And so the way we solve that problem with Let's Talk Bitcoin is by having a scheduled recording time every week, and then meeting on a voice chatting software called Mumble, which has high resolution and low latency. So it sounds like we're in the same room, but we're actually really not. So those are all things to think about when you're planning out a podcast. The more hosts, the more difficult it can be to have everybody in the same place at the same time, talking to one another in the right mindset and sounding good. And so I mentioned Mumble just a minute ago, but how do you connect if there's more than one person on the show? If it's just you talking into a microphone, it's pretty easy. You can kind of do a show anywhere, anytime, as long as you're ready for it. But if there's more than one person, if you're interviewing a guest, or if you have a co-host, or if you have multiple co-hosts, how are you going to do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. A lot of people use Skype for multi-person podcasts. Skype has some issues with audio quality, where it'll drop out sometimes if somebody doesn't have a great internet connection. And sometimes it'll drop out for a minute and then it'll speed up the voices really fast. And it sounds kind of funny, right? Mumble doesn't have those issues. The only thing about Mumble is it's a low latency, high quality voice chatting program. It's made for gaming and it's open source, which is great, unlike Skype, which is closed source. But you need a server to connect to with Mumble. So they're all about trade-offs. There's also a bunch of recording software for Skype, like Pamela, Call Recorder, Audio Hijack. Those are all things you can kind of read about. Those are all pay software, though, so you got to pay for the way to do that. Yes?
I think it's worth mentioning that Skype's also owned by Microsoft, which is the software tyrants of the world. And it kind of bugs me when I listen to the podcast and they talk about using Skype, because I feel like they're promoting tyranny. I mean, it depends on how intense you are about software tyranny, but it's definitely worth noting with that.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's something you value, you may prefer to listen to podcasts that use open source software to record and alternatives to Skype. So Google Plus too. You could say that maybe,
exactly.
Maybe the same thing. However,
it's unfortunate. Yeah, Google's they're really useful, but you got to remember, Google's the customer, you're the provider.
Sure.
You're giving them information, and they're offering you little tools that are whatever.
Well, it doesn't matter if the NSA is listening, because everybody can listen on your podcast anyway. But
oh yeah, exactly. just throwing it out there. Those are
yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, Google Plus, you can do a Hangout, which means multiple people getting on video chat, and you can just send it directly to YouTube after that. So that's super easy for multiple people. But anyway, there's also Audio Compass that's more for radio quality shows. I know the Freedom Fiends use that. They have 2 remote co-hosts and they broadcast to radio and XM. So there's all kinds of different solutions. Just one thing about editing. I said that it's a temptation to kind of, let's do a do-over, when you're podcasting. If you're recording with a bunch of different people or with yourself and you know that you're going to edit it later, there's a lot of temptation to say, let me try that again, let me say that a little bit better. And yeah, you can make a really high quality show that way, but you might spend a lot of time editing, and that can be very discouraging if it takes a lot of time to edit. And it can take a lot of time. Before you know it, you're cutting out every and You are not just cutting out the parts where you said, oh, let me have a do-over. You're cutting out every little tick in your speech, and maybe not economizing on your speech to begin with to get rid of those ticks before they even get out onto the audio. So that's just something to consider. Are you going to do editing? How are we doing on time?
15 minutes.
15 minutes. OK, cool. Well, I'll start wrapping this up, but just software to record. We've got Audacity and GarageBand. Those are the two favorites of most podcasters I know. There's also Adobe Audition. That's a little more professional, I guess, but of course it's Adobe software. And Audacity is open source and cross-platform, so it works on Linux, Mac, Windows, anything, and it's open source. So you can support open source software by doing your podcast. Microphones, this is worth doing some research on. It depends on your budget, but there are some great microphones that are under $100 that will give you a professional sounding podcast. Don't skip on the pop filters or windscreens, because when you're saying podcast, there's a pop. You know, it's called a plosive, right, in speech or linguistics, right? And so you really need a piece of fabric there to soften that sound. And when you have that, it sounds a lot more professional. And remember, we said that audio quality is so important. If people hear it, your podcast in their earphones, and every time you say podcast, it's blowing out their ears, they're probably not going to listen. So it's always a good idea to have that. Mixing board or not, the more people you have, the more likely it's probably that you're going to need a mixer. You can control the volume on everybody's channel individually. That's probably the best idea if you're going to have multiple voices. If it's just you or maybe a guest on Skype or Mumble, then you may be able to just get away with a USB microphone. That might be the best solution that plugs directly into your computer. But all this stuff is online. I actually have a page on porktherapy.com called About the Studio, so you can see the equipment that I use there, if you want to. You need a computer that's going to be able to render the audio. Some computers, if they don't have much computing power, like a little netbook like I'm using right here, they can take forever to render audio, to mix it down into an MP3 format. So that's a consideration. You want something that can store your archives, because sometimes you want to go back and use content that you may not have released right away, or you wanted to store, or you were saving to edit later. It's good to have enough storage. And as I mentioned, an ergonomic location. And the more backups you can do, the better. It's always helpful to get a backup. I can't tell you how many times I've needed to use a backup that I made, and sometimes I've needed to have a backup but didn't have a backup. So try to record from at least 2 sources if possible, and you can go from there. Even if it's just somebody's phone just on the table with a voice recorder, it's better than losing your content. And then how do you distribute a podcast? Well, all kinds of different ways. iTunes, you can have an RSS feed. You can go on SoundCloud, that's really popular now, because people can comment. People can comment right within the audio file, and it's really pretty, and it makes it easy to share on SoundCloud. YouTube, if you're doing video content, it's pretty much unbeatable. Stitcher is a streaming service where people can tune into your channel and just stream your podcast without having to download it from their phone. And then there's also radio, if you want to go that route. So all kinds of ways to get your podcast out there. Think about who you're trying to reach, right? Who you're trying to reach going to be on SoundCloud? Or is who you're trying to reach going to maybe be more likely to listen to the radio? That's a good question to ask. And how do you promote a podcast? Honestly, it helps to do social media, but I think the best way to get more listeners for your podcast is to go on other podcasts that are similar to yours, because they already listen to them, right? So people who are interested in paleo food are going to listen to, Rob Wolf's podcast or maybe Chris Kresser's podcast. And if you're a guest on them, then they're going to say, oh, Stephanie has a paleo podcast too. I guess I can add her feed and check her out. So, go for the people who are already listening to podcasts. I was going to talk about monetization of podcasts. This is something that not everybody does. And I'll just blow through this really quickly, and we can have some questions after that. But there's a bunch of different models that people use to monetize their podcasts. I would say if you are primarily starting a podcast to make money, that could be really difficult. Often people do not successfully monetize their podcasts unless they're already a celebrity or have some expertise and are very well known in a certain area, but it can be done. It can definitely be done. And there's a bunch of different ways that people do that. Some people take donations, right? You're getting value for value. But the downside is not many people donate, as a lot of podcasters can tell you. It's kind of inconvenient. It's kind of difficult, and you got to remind them. You got to kind of ask for it. Hey, send me a donation if you like my show. That can be hard for some people to do because they don't like asking for money. And you also have to deal with maybe PayPal if you want to make it convenient for people, and they can lock down your account. They can do all kinds of things. Bitcoin helps with that, makes it more frictionless to donate, but it's still a little bit of something that we need to overcome. The other good thing about donations is, you can feel really appreciated when someone sends you a donation. If you're doing a podcast, because one of the things you want is that sense that somebody's listening to you and they value what you have to say. There's nothing that beats the donation model. How about like a freemium kind of upsell model? So like basically you would give away your podcast or some other content for free, and then somebody pays to get bonus content, or they pay to get something extra. Or like they pay to get your investment newsletter or your investment podcast or something like that.
Archives too.
Or archives, yeah, older archives of the show. Yeah, a lot of people do that. Like there's a podcast called Red Bar Radio that's been around for a while, and they have that model where they have a club that like listeners can join for $5 a month, and then they get access to extra raunchy bonus content. Now, some people may not want that, but some people do, right? So it's all about what your listeners have. So, and sometimes you can do things with your premium content that you just can't do with your regular content, right? But it takes some time maybe to establish yourself as somebody who listeners would want to buy bonus content from or something like that. You have to build up kind of a reserve of bonus content, and you gotta give them a reason to pay you, right? There has to be something there where people want to get extra content from you and they're willing to give you money for it. So those are things to be aware of. Advertising. The biggest problem with advertising on podcasts is some people say, wow, a podcaster is going to be beholden to the advertisers if they have ads on their show. Not necessarily. Some people really are very discriminating about the advertisers that they have, and they try really to maintain a separation between advertising and what they're doing on their podcast. It can also be really lucrative. If you have a popular show and maybe a niche content, people will want to advertise on your show. So think about sort of how to balance that. It also kind of requires a large or dedicated audience or both. You got to have metrics. You got to be able to show your sponsors how many downloads you have so that they'll want to pay up and advertise. But it also, yeah, thank you. 2 minutes left. But it also, lets the listener off the hook for paying for your content. All right. Another way to go is sort of by affiliate marketing. Like people have Amazon links and things like that. I'm just going to go through this really quickly. I will put this presentation up on porktherapy.com to anybody who wants to look at it later. And there's benefits and downsides to that. Some people do a mixed model, like donations plus advertising or something like that. And some people do nonprofit podcasting, right? They're just like, hey, I want to have fun doing this, and I'm not going to worry about trying to monetize it. That's a strategy too. You may end up spending money on your podcast, but if you're okay with that, maybe that's fine. All right, so I hope you may now, after this talk, have an idea of what you might like to do if you want to be a podcaster in the future. You maybe have some ideas if you are already a podcaster for what you want to do with your current podcast. And maybe you've decided you never want a podcast. It's just too complicated. Or maybe you just understand a little bit better what podcasters do. So you can hear me on Let's Talk Bitcoin, Free Talk Live, and Pork Therapy, and all the information is there. I also work with Free Aid. We're here. Volunteer first aid, health and safety, and education and networking. And so thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I appreciate that. I don't know if do you have time for a question?
I did just want to add a few things. Some things are important. You didn't cover your speech, or important to look at with microphones, looking at limiters, also noise reduction to reduce the hum that's in the background. And there's also a software tool for if you're capturing audio from different distances and the levels are different. There's a free tool you can get out there from the conversation called a Levelator. I think it's
Levelator.
Yeah, and that'll really bump all of your audio up level.
Yep,
And
Levelator is
really
your
helps.
friend.
So there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to really enhance the quality of your podcast, so you don't off-put listeners by the varying difference in qualities, even just the same podcast.
Is there a website where there's mention of various tools that you use to improve quality of software?
The Levelator that Calvin was talking about can be at
Right, is there a website that discusses?
It's the Conversations Network.
Yeah, Conversations Network does Levelator. Thank you. I think we have to wrap it up, but if anybody has a question, you can ask me afterwards. Thank you.